In January of 1492, the city of Granada was handed over to the Catholic monarchs. There was no final assault or street-by-street combat. The war had lasted 10 years, and the exhausted Nasrid kingdom agreed to surrender. Boabdil signed the capitulation and handed over the keys in a sober ceremony, with Castilian guards stationed at every entrance to the Alhambra. From that moment on, the city came under the control of Isabella and Ferdinand, not as a symbol, but as a possession that had to be reorganized, monitored, and if necessary, transformed from within. The first days were calm. Soldiers maintained order. The agreements were read in public squares, and it was repeatedly emphasized that Muslims would be allowed to keep their religion, their customs, and their property. But surveillance increased from the very first day. Commissioners were stationed in neighborhoods, names were recorded, and documents were inspected. Castilian officials, often accompanied by clerics, began gathering information about mosques, schools, and families. They were not seeking to ensure coexistence. They were seeking to control what did not belong to them. The conditions agreed upon with Boabdil were clear, but Isabella did not see them as final. Granada was not just a conquered territory. It was a city shaped by centuries of Islamic culture, by different traditions, by a way of life that, in her view, was incompatible with the new order she sought to impose. For her, the surrender was not an endpoint, but the beginning of a greater task: to integrate the last corner of the kingdom into a single religious model. In the following months, the promises made to the Muslims began to fade. Public teachings of the Quran were banned, rulings by Islamic judges were questioned, and traditional ceremonies were canceled. Some religious leaders were arrested for refusing to cooperate, and others fled. Conversions began as recommendations, then as warnings, and soon as the only possible way out. Many pretended to adapt in order to survive, but others were left with nothing. Isabella gave no grand speeches, nor did she impose chaotic decrees. Her approach was slower, more structured. She knew that to consolidate control over Granada, a military presence was not enough. The daily lives of its inhabitants had to be altered. What they ate, what they spoke, and how they married, how they prayed, and whom they obeyed, all had to change. It was not punishment for the war. It was a complete reorganization. The fall of Granada was celebrated throughout Castile as the end of the Reconquista. But within the city, there was no relief. What began as a negotiated surrender turned into a transition toward distrust, fear, and the gradual disappearance of everything that had once been part of that culture. Isabella made no secret of it. Her goal was not to maintain coexistence, but to leave behind everything that did not fit her vision of order. But who was Isabella of Castile? Isabella was born on April 22, 1451, in Madrigal de las Altas Torres. She was the daughter of John II of Castile and his second wife, Isabella of Portugal. Her birth was not celebrated as a major political event. Her half-brother, Henry IV, was already heir to the throne. She was not expected to rule. She had no army, no allies, and no position of power. And yet, the environment she grew up in forced her to observe, listen, and adapt much earlier than other girls her age. Shortly after her birth, her father died. Isabella was 3 years old. Henry IV inherited the crown and ordered his half-sister and her mother to be moved to Arevalo, a town relatively distant from the court. There she spent her childhood in an ambiguous situation. She was not a prisoner, but she had no access to palace life or centers of decision-making. The atmosphere was precarious, and the widowed queen suffered frequent mental breakdowns. Servants came and went as alliances shifted. Isabella grew up seeing how loyalty was short-lived. and how affection was not enough to keep one safe. During her childhood, Castile was in one of its most unstable periods. The nobility was divided, the king was questioned, and tensions with Portugal, Navarre, and Aragon persisted. Every decision had consequences. Every appointment raised suspicion. Henry IV was a weak monarch, unable to assert authority over his vassals. His reign was marked by internal rebellions, accusations about his private life, and constant doubts about his daughter, Juana, mockingly called La Beltraneja. It was said she was not his legitimate daughter, but the result of an adulterous affair between the queen and a courtier. Isabella was called to court when she was about 13 years old. She was placed near the king, but given no voice or room to act. She watched as her brother negotiated with nobles from a position of weakness, how he traded privileges for temporary support, and how the great houses of the kingdom organized to impose their terms. The court was not a place of stability. It was an elegant battlefield, where favors were earned by promising loyalty that rarely lasted. During those years, Isabella deepened her religious education. She surrounded herself with confessors and clerics who saw in her a pious, disciplined young woman, removed from the chaos of court life. Religion was not just faith, it was a structure of thought. It offered her clear answers, hierarchy, and order. Unlike the political power around her, full of ambiguity and betrayal, Catholic doctrine was firm and demanding, and she embraced it as part of her identity. When her brother declared her official heir, he did so under pressure. She was not his first choice, but he needed to stop the advance of the nobles who wanted to place Juana on the throne. Isabella accepted, but she set conditions. She demanded that she not be forced to marry anyone without her consent. It was an unusual stance. Noblewomen were often used as political currency, but she wanted to choose because she understood that marriage was not about affection, but a tool of power. Soon after, in 1469, she married Ferdinand of Aragon. She did so in secret, without the permission of Henry IV, which was seen as an act of rebellion. She had joined the heir of another kingdom without royal approval, and at a time when Castile was divided. The marriage was a calculated political move. Ferdinand brought military legitimacy, strategic alliances, and ambition. Isabella brought a direct link to the legitimate Castilian line and a reputation for firmness. After the marriage, conflict erupted. Henry IV withdrew his support from Isabella and again declared Juana as his heir. Two factions formed. The War of Succession began. Castile was preparing for a prolonged struggle in which Isabella would have to prove that she not only knew how to pray, but also how to rule. Her religiosity never disappeared, but from that moment on, it coexisted with hard decisions, military alliances, propaganda, and purges. The young woman who had grown up in Arevalo, far from the noise of power, had learned how to use it. War of succession and seizure of power. The death of Henry IV in December 1474 left the kingdom divided. For some nobles, the legitimate heir was his daughter, Juana, backed by Portugal. For others, it was Isabella, who had already proclaimed herself queen in Segovia, just 2 days after the burial. There was no time for mourning. The conflict had begun. Juana had the support of a significant portion of the Castilian nobility, the Kingdom of Portugal, and ecclesiastical sectors that rejected the way Isabella had taken the throne. Isabella, for her part, had the support of the Mendoza family, the Enriquez family, the powerful city of Toledo, and the political machinery she had built with Ferdinand. Neither side was willing to yield. War was inevitable. For 5 years, between 1475 and 1479, Castile became a battlefield. It was not a massive war with large armies, but a series of campaigns, sieges, ambushes, and betrayals. In Zamora, Toro, Trujillo, and many other towns, alliances changed hands quickly. Isabella and Ferdinand learned fast. They knew that victory did not rely solely on direct combat, but on controlling key cities, rewarding loyalty, and swiftly punishing disloyalty. Wherever they took control, they reorganized local governments, placed their own men, and demanded oaths of obedience. Power was rebuilt from the ground up. One of the key moments was the Battle of Toro in 1476. Although militarily inconclusive, Isabella and Ferdinand quickly declared it a great victory. They spread letters, bulletins, and public statements claiming that God had supported their cause. The battle became an instrument of legitimacy. From that moment on, many nobles who had hesitated began to switch sides. Not out of faith, but calculation. The war was also being won at desks and in printing presses. Isabella was not one to forgive easily. Those who had openly opposed her were stripped of lands, privileges, and positions. Some were prosecuted, others exiled. A few were executed. The repression was selective. Each punishment served as a warning. The queen had come to stay, and the price of defying her was made clear. At the same time, she reorganized the kingdom's administration. She intervened in local councils, reformed the treasury, ordered audits, and sent inspectors to investigate abuses, all with a clear goal: to re-centralize power. For decades, great lords had acted like kings in their own domains. Isabella understood that this had to end. Winning the war was not enough. A new way of governing had to be imposed. In the territories that had been conflict zones, surveillance increased. Routes were established for troop movement, key positions were fortified, and noble families loyal to the crown were encouraged to intermarry. Loyal bishops were rewarded with greater influence. The church became another arm of her policy. The message was simple. Those within the system would prosper. Those who defied it would be brought down. Ferdinand, from Aragon, supported her every step. But the protagonist was Isabella. She oversaw appointments, issued orders, corrected reports. Her style of governing was direct and meticulous. She delegated only what was necessary. She did not tolerate improvisation. She wanted control, information, and obedience. In 1479, with the signing of the Treaty of Alcazovas, Portugal officially recognized Isabella and Ferdinand as the monarchs of Castile. Juana was sent to a convent. She had lost without ever really having a chance. For many, that treaty ended a dynastic war, but for Isabella it meant something more: the definitive consecration of a power model. Her power. From that moment forward, her entire reign would be shaped by that logic. Unity was not requested. It was imposed. Doubts were resolved by force. Concessions were granted only when they reinforced authority. She had learned in war what it meant to rule an unstable kingdom, and she had no intention of letting fragmentation return. Thus ended the Civil War, not with a triumphant parade, but with a web of loyalties rebuilt through decrees, repression, and pragmatism. Isabella was no longer just Queen of Castile. She was the master of the board, and she had only just begun to move the pieces. Inquisition and extreme surveillance. After the Civil War, Isabella had the crown, but not true control of the kingdom. Castile remained divided by political tensions, noble privileges, and a population marked by religious diversity. Jews, Moors, Old Christians, and conversos coexisted in a fragile balance. For Isabella, that diversity was not a strength, but a risk, and she decided to eliminate it. In 1478, she obtained from Pope Sixtus IV the papal bull authorizing the creation of the Spanish Inquisition. Unlike earlier tribunals, this Inquisition did not answer to Rome. It answered to the crown. Isabella insisted it fall under her direct authority. That's why she placed her confessor, Friar Tomás de Torquemada, at its head, a man she trusted with a clear vision to monitor the faith in order to strengthen the throne. The declared aim was to control the conversos, suspected of secretly practicing their former religions. But in practice, the tribunal became a network of political and social control. The first courts were set up in Seville and Córdoba. They soon spread throughout Castile. The procedure was methodical. A grace edict was announced. Anonymous denunciations were encouraged, and interrogations began. Evidence did not follow modern standards. Rumors, contradictions, or suspicious behavior were enough. Torture was allowed. Punishments ranged from public penance to death by burning at the stake. Everything was recorded, signed, and sealed. Isabella was informed. She read reports, requested reviews, and never halted the process. If mistakes occurred, they were corrected with even more vigilance. For her, the Inquisition was a tool to purge the kingdom from within. It did not seek individual justice, it sought general order. Conversos were the first to fall. Doctors, jurists, merchants, even clergy. Many had been Christians for generations, but that was not enough. Any small gesture could be incriminating. Not eating pork, speaking Hebrew, or following family customs. Fear became the norm. Cross-accusations destroyed alliances, ruined families, and helped the monarchy reclaim power over formerly autonomous cities and lineages. The official church tolerated it in silence. It knew the tribunal answered to the Queen, not the Pope. The Inquisition was not a momentary excess. It was a strategy of governance, a legal and religious system for imposing obedience. Isabella was not seeking diversity, she was seeking purity. And with the Inquisition, she began to enforce it. The Edict of Expulsion. In 1492, the same year Granada fell, and Columbus set sail toward the unknown. Isabella and Ferdinand signed a decree that would transform Iberian history, the Edict of Expulsion. It ordered the departure of all Jews from the kingdom within 4 months, under threat of imprisonment, confiscation, or death. It was not a decision of the church or a response to popular unrest. It was a direct order from the royal authority. For centuries, Jews had been an essential part of the peninsula's urban and cultural fabric. They were doctors, translators, tax collectors, merchants. Some were protected by nobles, others lived under fragile tolerance. But for Isabella, that diversity was not a richness, it was a crack. The Inquisition already monitored the conversos, but she wanted to go further, to eliminate the root of the problem, erase the reference point. The decree was signed in Granada shortly after its conquest. It stated that all Jews who did not convert had to leave the kingdom before July 31st. They were not allowed to take gold, silver, weapons, or horses, only what they could carry by hand. Many sold their belongings at ruinous prices. Others were swindled or assaulted along the way. It is estimated that between 100,000 and 150,000 people were expelled. Some advisors warned of the economic consequences, but Isabella did not see it as a loss. It was a necessary cleansing. She wanted to rebuild the kingdom under a single faith, without gray areas. She didn't sign it on impulse, nor under ecclesiastical pressure. She signed it because she believed in it. Torquemada, of course, supported the measure, but he was not its author. Isabella made the decision, assumed the cost, and never reconsidered it. The impact was immediate. Jewish neighborhoods were emptied, Synagogues were closed, schools shut down. Many converted out of fear. Those who stayed lived under constant suspicion. The kingdom was now officially more pure, but also poorer in diversity and knowledge. Abandoned properties were redistributed, the royal treasury benefited, and control was reinforced. Because after the expulsion, there was no visible difference anymore, only a population under watch. The edict was not an emotional reaction. It was a strategy of power. One more step in building a homogeneous kingdom under one law and one faith. And in Isabella's eyes, it was exactly what needed to be done. The conquest of America. When Christopher Columbus returned to the Iberian Peninsula in 1493, he brought neither gold nor spices, but he did bring something even more valuable to Queen Isabella, the possibility of extending the faith. For the Queen, America was not primarily a commercial venture or a promise of wealth. It was a virgin field of souls to be saved. This was clearly expressed in the instructions, letters, and decrees she issued from the beginning. The new world had to become a reflection of the old, under the same principles she had imposed in Castile. And it all started with religion. Isabella saw overseas expansion as a natural extension of her internal policies. Just as she had purged diversity on the peninsula through the Inquisition and the expulsion of the Jews, in America, the goal was to act preemptively, to evangelize before there was room for heresies. From the outset, she made it clear that the mission was not only to explore or conquer, but to Christianize. And Christianity, in her vision, could not be separated from obedience to the crown. In the agreements signed with Columbus before his voyage, Isabella stipulated that the new territories would be under Castilian sovereignty and that all acts carried out there must follow the laws of the kingdom. There was no intention of allowing hybrid models or parallel cultures. The project was totalizing. The new lands were not just lands. They were peoples to be subjected to a new logic, that of the cross and the crown. When the results of the first voyage were made known, the Queen reacted swiftly. She summoned theologians, jurists, and advisors to discuss the implications of the discovery. Instead of celebrating a geographical find, she celebrated the opportunity to spread the true faith. And she did so using the same language she had employed against the Muslims in Granada: evangelization, conversion, unity. The missionary impulse was immediate. She ordered friars to be sent to baptize the natives, teach them the catechism, and supervise religious practices. The first Franciscans arrived shortly after the second expedition. Alongside them came notaries, officials, soldiers, and merchants. Each departing ship was not just a means of transport. It was a cell of the new order. Isabella issued rules about how the indigenous peoples should be treated. In theory, they were to be protected, instructed, and guided toward the Christian faith. But in practice, that discourse quickly became a tool of domination. Any resistance to baptism was seen as a rejection of royal authority, and any cultural practice foreign to Christianity was viewed as idolatry. In other words, as a crime, unlike in Castile, where repression was applied to already defined heresies. In America, orthodoxy had to be created from scratch. There was no room to negotiate with ancestral beliefs. The indigenous languages had to be replaced by Castilian. Temples were to be destroyed or turned into churches. Tribal or communal systems of organization had to be subordinated to the Castilian municipal model. Even personal names were to be changed after baptism. The Queen insisted that the natives were subjects of the crown, with rights, yes, but also obligations. and the most important of these was spiritual submission. In 1500, when reports of abuse by some colonists began to arrive, Isabella issued instructions ordering that the Indians be treated as free people and not as slaves. But those words did not stop the development of the encomienda system, a structure in which a group of natives was assigned to a colonist to be evangelized in exchange for their labor. The line between mission and exploitation was blurred from the start. Isabella did not live to see the true impact of the system she had set in motion. She died in 1504, when the first permanent settlements were just beginning to take shape. But what she established was a clear directive. America was to be evangelized under Castilian control, with no tolerance for previous religious forms, and with direct supervision from the crown. The result was the importation of a model that had already proven effective on the peninsula, a system of spiritual surveillance, an official language, an imported ruling class, and a theological justification for every act of imposition. Thus, America became an extension of Isabella's project, not as a promised land, but as a space to apply the lessons learned in Castile. What had been repression in the Old World became conquest under a spiritual pretext in the New. The death of Isabella the Catholic. Isabella died on November 26, 1504, in Medina del Campo. She was 53 years old, her body exhausted from pregnancies, travels, family losses, and illness. Her final years were marked by physical fragility, but not by doubt. Until the end, she firmly maintained the direction of her project, to unify the kingdom not only by force, but through belief, language, and surveillance. Before dying, she dictated a will that was not just a distribution of her estate. It was a political and spiritual roadmap. She reaffirmed her desire to protect the indigenous people of America, to preserve the unity of the kingdoms under her daughter Joanna, and to maintain the Inquisition as a guardian of the faith. She left no room for revision. What she had done out of conviction. By the time of her death, Castile was no longer the kingdom she had inherited. When she ascended the throne, power was fragmented among noble lineages, semi-autonomous cities, and economically powerful minorities. 25 years later, all that had been compressed under a single command center, the crown. The military orders, the treasury, diplomacy, and even justice responded to the throne. The nobility had been subdued, the church subordinated, and the religious minorities eliminated or converted. This transformation turned Castile into a solid power, but also a rigid one. What was gained in cohesion was lost in diversity. Isabella left no room for alternative ways of living in her kingdom. Thought had to conform to orthodoxy, language to Castilian, religious practice to state-supervised Catholicism, and those who did not adapt were eliminated, expelled, or reconverted. The effect was long-lasting. The expulsion of the Jews and pressure on converts reshaped urban life, altered trade, administration, medicine, and culture. The Inquisition continued to operate for centuries, and the model of evangelization that Isabella promoted in America was not an exception. It was a natural continuation of her logic of control. Her death marked the beginning of a difficult transition. Joanna was declared mentally unfit, and her husband, Philip the Handsome, died shortly afterward. The emerging figure was her grandson, Charles, who would inherit an unprecedented empire. But many of the structures that supported that empire were born with Isabella. She laid the foundations of the mode Spanish state, but did so using the methods of fear, exclusion, and ideological repression. For centuries, Isabella was turned into a symbol. Official chroniclers portrayed her as pious, just, and the mother of the nation. The Church sought her beatification. She was presented as a model queen, even as a pioneer of European unity. But that narrative left out the cost, the fear she sowed, the pyres she condoned, the communities that vanished by her decisions, the policies she justified in the name of faith. Over time, Isabella's image has been shaped by the needs of those writing history. For some, she was the queen who unified Spain. For others, the one who expelled those who didn't fit. For many, both. Her legacy is not just about conquests or alliances, but about a structure of power that outlived her. Institutions born of her direct will. Laws drafted under her supervision, a model of governance based on centralization, uniformity, and control. And that mold was not fleeting. It shaped how the kingdom expanded, how it faced its enemies, how it suppressed dissent, and how it saw itself for generations. In her vision, there was no room for deviation, no room for error, no room for difference. To many, Isabella died with a clear conscience. She had fulfilled her mission. She had delivered to God a unified, guarded, and purified kingdom. But that same kingdom, having closed in on itself, became more vulnerable to fanaticism, stagnation, and censorship. What seemed like order was, at times, silence. And what seemed like unity was often submission. And so ended the reign of a woman who was not just a queen. She was the architect of a state, of an ideology, and of a machinery that would outlive all her descendants.